What Bill Gaither did during a live recording session not long ago left everyone in that room completely still, and the people who witnessed it say they have never seen him react that way in more than 50 years of gospel music ministry. For fans who have followed his work since the earliest Homecoming recordings, this moment will mean everything. A letter arrived. Bill read it, and somewhere in the middle of the second paragraph, he stopped being a performer and became something else entirely. A man undone by what a stranger had written to him in plain handwriting on plain paper. The full story of what that letter contained and what it revealed about this ministry's reach has been moving quietly through the Southern gospel community ever since it happened. Stay with us, because what comes into focus at the 10-minute mark is the detail that no one covering Christian music has been willing to address directly until now. Bill Gaither has been a presence in gospel music for more than 6 decades, and his name sits at the center of nearly everything that shaped Southern gospel in the modern era. Born in 1936 in Alexandria, Indiana, he grew up singing in a church congregation with his brother Danny and sister Mary Ann, and that foundation never left him, even as his career expanded far beyond what anyone in that small-town church could have imagined. Together with his wife Gloria, Bill wrote "He Touched Me" in 1963, a hymn that became one of the most recorded songs in gospel music history, covered by artists from Elvis Presley to the singers who still fill arenas under the Gaither Homecoming banner today. For millions of fans who found their faith deepened through the Gaither Homecoming video series, those gatherings of gospel legends that Bill launched in 1991 with "I've Just Started Living," Bill was never simply a songwriter or a producer. He was the man who gathered the family. He understood that George Younce and Jake Hess and Vestal Goodman were not aging voices to be retired, but living treasures who deserved one more room full of people who truly loved them. And so he built that room again and again, on stage and on film, for 3 decades running. For the millions of fans who grew up watching those Homecoming videos, Bill Gaither was not just a name on an album cover. He was the reason the family kept showing up. By the early 2000s, the Homecoming series had moved more than 40 million albums and videos worldwide, a number that still stops people when they hear it, even people working inside the gospel music industry. What Bill had built was not simply a catalog. He had built a congregation without walls, a church that gathered inside living rooms and nursing homes and cars, and anywhere a person could press play and feel less alone in their faith. That is the context for everything that follows, and it matters, because the letter that broke him was written by someone who understood exactly what that congregation had meant to them personally, in ways no concert ticket ever could have captured. The recording in question happened during what those close to the Gaither organization describe as a routine session, though anyone who has spent time in that world knows that nothing Bill does is ever entirely routine. The room was filled with musicians and singers and cameras running, carrying the particular organized energy that surrounds any homecoming gathering. What made that day different was something that arrived before a single note had been sung. A member of the production team handed Bill a letter that had come through the ministry's fan mail address, typed carefully across several pages, and Bill started reading it quietly off to one side while others were getting settled. He had read thousands of letters across the decades, perhaps tens of thousands, and the people who know him well say he treats every single one with the same seriousness, because he believes the people who write them have earned that. What happened next, though, was something the room had not been prepared for. The letter came from a woman in her late 70s who had been connected to Bill's work in gospel music since the mid-1960s, someone who had grown up hearing "Because He Lives" at every significant moment of her family's life, at her wedding, at her children's baptisms, and at her husband's memorial service. She wrote about sitting with her husband during his final weeks in hospice care, playing homecoming videos on a small television in the corner of the room, and how her husband would mouth the words to the songs even when he no longer had the strength to speak out loud. She wrote about the night he passed, and how the song playing in that moment was one of Bill's, and how she had held his hand and thanked God that music had given them something to share when words had completely run out. And that's when the room noticed that Bill had stopped moving. Standing there with the letter in both hands, not reading anymore, just standing, he had gone entirely still in a way that people who had worked alongside him for years had never once seen. The musicians who witnessed it say it took a moment to understand he was crying because it happened quietly, the way grief sometimes does when it finally finds a place to land after years of being held somewhere private. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to the next item on the schedule. And the session simply stopped. Because what was unfolding in that corner of the room was more important than anything else planned for that day. And this is where the story reaches something that the people closest to Bill's ministry have been reluctant to discuss publicly. But what they shared in the days that followed changes the way you understand what this man has carried alongside all the joy his music represents. Stay with us, because what Bill said when he finally did speak, and what Gloria confirmed separately when asked about it later, is something that reframes what you thought you knew about this ministry and the private weight it carries. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle expected to become part of the public record. When Bill finally lowered the letter and looked up at the people in that room, what he said had nothing to do with the recording schedule or the songs planned for that afternoon. According to those who were present, his words came to something like this: that he had spent his entire life wondering whether the music was actually reaching people the way he had hoped, in the quiet places, in the real places, in the moments that never get recorded or celebrated or put on an album cover, and that this woman's letter had just given him the answer he had been waiting for. He had never doubted God, he said, but he had doubted himself more times than anyone knew, and more recently than people might expect from someone whose career had reached the level that his had. The Homecoming series was still running. The concerts were still filled. But Bill Gaither, standing in that room with that letter in his hands, admitted that he had been carrying a private question for a very long time, and that the answer had arrived in a plain envelope from a woman he had never met, and in all likelihood, never would. What Gloria shared afterward, in a brief conversation with someone on the ministry team who later spoke about it, was that this had been building in Bill for some time. The losses of longtime homecoming friends had accumulated across the years. Jake Hess, gone in 2004, Vestal Goodman in 2003, Howard Goodman in 2002, and George Younce in 2005. Each of those departures had taken a piece of the family Bill had built, and he had carried the grief that followed in ways he did not always make visible to the people around him. Gloria said that Bill would go quiet after certain concerts in ways she recognized but did not always address directly, because some things a person has to sit with before they can speak them. The fan's letter, she indicated, had done something that decades of commercial success and critical recognition had never managed, which was to answer the question Bill was actually asking. That question had nothing to do with record sales or platform numbers or the size of any arena. What he needed to know was whether the music had been present in the moments that mattered most to real people, the moments that happen away from every stage. And this woman, writing from her grief and her gratitude, had said plainly, yes, it had been there. It had been enough. The reaction among others in the Gaither world when this story began to circulate quietly through people who knew was one of recognition rather than surprise. Mark Lowry, who has known Bill for decades and whose warmth has always coexisted with a deep reverence for the ministry they share, reportedly said that this sounded exactly like the man he knew, that the one who had given so much for so long would still find himself needing to know the work had mattered, and that when that confirmation finally arrived, it would come not through an award or a ceremony, but through a letter from someone who had sat in a hospice room with a dying husband and played homecoming videos until the very end. Wes Hampton, who joined the Gaither vocal band and became one of its most beloved voices during the 2000 seconds, once described Bill in an interview as someone who treated every concert as if it might be the last chance to reach someone who needed to hear something true. That description carries different weight now, understanding that the man who built this entire world of gospel music and Christian worship had been quietly asking, in his own way, whether the reaching had actually worked. The fans who had followed this ministry across decades of homecoming videos and live concerts and late-night television specials never doubted the answer. Bill, apparently, had held the question close and privately for years, and the letter from that one woman finally made it stop. For those who have followed Bill's journey through the years, what this moment reveals goes well beyond the story of one recording session. Those who discovered the Gaither world through the early homecoming videos, the ones that felt like stumbling into someone's living room where all your favorite voices happened to be gathered, understand something about Bill Gaither that newer fans are still learning. His gift was never only songwriting, and it was never only production, and it was never only his ability to place a great voice in front of an audience. His gift was sincerity, of a kind that cannot be manufactured or performed, because it comes from someone who genuinely believes that music and faith are not separate things, but the same thing expressed in two different languages. What this story tells us, in the wider world of contemporary Christian music today, is that even the people who build the platforms for faith-based expression carry their own questions, their own doubts, their own need to be told that what they gave was worth giving. Ministry does not exempt a person from that need, and it may in fact make that need more present, because the stakes feel higher when you have asked people to trust you with the music of their most sacred moments of Christianity and grief and love and loss. There is something deeply honest about a man at this stage of his life, with 40 million albums and videos sold, and a legacy that has shaped Southern gospel and contemporary Christian music for 3 generations of believers, standing in a room full of people and crying over a letter from a stranger. That letter contained the one thing that decades of success could not provide, which was the simple, personal, unambiguous confirmation that the music had been present when it was needed most. Those who have been fans of Bill's work since the early homecoming days know exactly what we mean when we say that the songs were never just songs. They were companions. And the moment when a fan sat down and put that truth on paper was the moment Bill understood, at a level that no applause had ever reached, what he had actually spent his life building. We would love to know in the comments below what a Gaither hymn has meant to you in a moment that mattered, because this community carries more of those stories than most people outside it ever realize. There is one more part of this story that most people have not connected yet, and it adds something important to what that letter truly represented. Bill's uncertainty about the ministry's real reach goes back further than this particular moment, further in fact than most fans would guess from the public record of his career. During the mid-1990s, when the Homecoming series was expanding rapidly and the videos were reaching audiences well beyond what anyone had projected, Bill gave an interview in which he described a private concern he carried about whether the gatherings were truly honoring the older artists or simply trading on their names and histories. He was asking, even then, whether what he was building was genuinely serving the people it claimed to honor. That question never fully left him. And that same question, turned outward toward the audience rather than inward toward the performers, was exactly what the fans' letter answered years later. Ministry team members who spoke about the recording session noted that Bill spent a long time after the initial moment sitting quietly with the letter, reading it a second time, and that he asked for it to be kept somewhere accessible rather than filed away with the general correspondence. He wanted to be able to return to it. Michael English, whose journey through personal failure and restoration has made him one of the most emotionally direct voices in the gospel music world, once said in a homecoming conversation that the fans of this music understand something about grace that the rest of the culture is still working out. He described letters he had received after his own public struggles, and how those letters had reached him in places that no professional support could access. What Bill experienced with this letter belongs to that same territory, the place where the message of Christianity meets real human need, not in a cathedral or on a stage, but in someone's handwriting, at the end of someone's most painful season. David Phelps, whose voice has been one of the defining sounds of the Gaither vocal band across multiple decades of recordings and worship concerts, said in one of his own public conversations that Bill had a way of creating spaces where people felt safe to bring their whole lives, not just the celebratory parts, but the broken parts, the grieving parts, the parts that did not resolve neatly into anything. The woman who wrote that letter had brought her broken part to the ministry years earlier through the music, and then she sent it back to Bill wrapped in gratitude. And somehow, after all those years and all those albums and all those homecoming stages, that exchange was what he needed most to receive. What happens next for Bill Gaither and his family is something the gospel community will be watching with the same care and attention it has given this ministry for 30 years. He has not stopped. The recordings continue. The concerts continue. The work of gathering the family, the living members of a community that now stretches across 3 full generations of Christian music and Southern gospel tradition, continues in exactly the form he always intended it to take. But there is a question this story leaves open, one that those close to the ministry have noted and not yet resolved. How many other letters like that one are sitting unopened, or have been read and set aside, never quite reaching the person who most needed to receive them? Bill was present when this one arrived. He read it, and the room changed in a way that everyone there will carry for a long time. Whatever comes next, fans who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing, and it is the same thing they have known since the first homecoming video appeared and made them realize someone was gathering the family on purpose. Bill Gaither's story is not finished, and the music he has given the world is still doing exactly what it was always written to do, reaching people in the quiet places, in the real places, in the moments that matter most. That has always been the promise of this ministry, and from the evidence of one letter in plain handwriting on plain paper, it remains true. If this story moved you, the next video will as well. We have been covering Guy Penrod's recent revelation about the decade that nearly ended his voice career, and what came out of that conversation is just as unexpected.